They shot the oldest man in the fleet. They expected a war they could win. They got a clerk with a brass stamp. Vesa Minor turns once every 30 hours, and from the outer ring it does not look like a station so much as a town somebody welded onto a rock and then stopped finishing. There are 4 docking spines, 2 of which have not moved in a century. There is a market street with a leak in it that 3 separate governments have promised to fix. And at the center, in a low building faced with stone hauled up from the planet below, there is a room with a long table, a bad ceiling light, and 400 years of paper. That room is the Concord Registry. On the 18th of May, in the year 2574, it held 1 old man, 1 clerk, 306 ledgers, and a framed document on the wall that nobody in the building had read all the way through in living memory. The document was the Concord of Vesa Minor, signed on the 12th of March, 2174, by 4 parties who had just finished trying to kill one another and had run out of the means to continue. It set the transit corridors. It set the docking rights, the salvage rules, the insurance bonds, the arbitration courts. It was, in every practical sense, the reason a freighter could leave 1 star and arrive at another with a reasonable expectation of being allowed to unload. 400 years later, it still worked. That was the problem with it. A thing that works for 400 years stops being a document and becomes weather. Nobody reads the weather. 2 decks up and 1,100 meters along the ring, in a chamber built for a larger institution than the one that now used it, the Standing Directorate of the Council of Bound Systems was in session. First Arbiter Draval had a summary in front of him and did not need to look at it. He knew the numbers the way a man knows his own street. 306 member systems, 52,000 civil hulls moving under Concord Transit title, a war fleet of 4,800, most of it newer than the treaty and all of it better. And on the other side of the arithmetic, Earth. Earth had 31 hulls. 22 of them were older than the officers commanding them. Earth had no seat on the directorate, no vote in the assembly, and no industry that anyone in the room could name without checking. Earth had one thing, and it was the reason they were all sitting there. Earth had the custodianship. The custodian of the Concord is not a ruler. The custodian is a bookkeeper. The office keeps the register, records which hull holds which transit title, publishes the priority order for the corridors, and countersigns 306 annual entries once a year with a pen. In 2174, 3 exhausted powers had needed someone to hold the books, and none of them would let another one do it. So they gave the smallest room in the house to the smallest people in it. Humans took the job because it came with an office and a stipend, and nobody else wanted it. For 400 years, the joke inside the council was that Earth had negotiated its way into permanent janitorial duty. Draval did not think it was a joke anymore. Priority in the corridors had become the whole game. A hull that moved first made money. A hull that waited did not. And the order of that queue was set by a human bookkeeper in a stone room. According to rules, a human bookkeeper interpreted. Draval had spent 4 years asking politely for the custodianship to be transferred to a council appointee. He had been refused 4 times, always courteously, always in writing, always by the same signature, so he had stopped asking. Second Chair Verne, who sat to his left and had a habit of reading documents he had already read, said, "Arbiter, the transfer requires the custodian to sign." Draval said, "It requires the chair to be filled. It does not specify how it became empty." Down in the registry, Admiral Tomas Reyes was signing. He was 106 years old. He had been commissioned at 22 and had served 84 years, which is not a career, it is a geological period. He came to Vesa Minor once a year for 11 days to countersign the annual entries, 1 system at a time, because the Concord said the custodian's own hand, and because he had decided long ago that the fastest way to lose an office is to make it look easy. He signed with an old pen. He kept a brass hand stamp in the desk drawer, worn smooth on the letters, that read, "Received." He used it on things that did not require it. He was on entry 284. Dravel stood at the chamber window and looked down at the market street, at the leak, at a woman selling something out of a heated case. Ordinary traffic. He had seen it 1,000 times. It looked different, and he could not have said why, and he decided the feeling was fatigue. He turned back to the room. "Draft the instrument of removal," he said. "The chair will be vacant by evening." Nobody in the chamber objected. Nobody in the chamber had read the Concord. Ansel Tazek had read the Concord, not because he was clever, because he had been given a job so small it left him time. He was clerk of records for the council registry, which meant he maintained the council's own copies of the instruments it had acceded to. And in the second week of May, he had been asked to certify the Concord text for a transfer memorandum. Certification meant checking the council's copy against the original, line for line, all 31 pages. It took him 4 days. On the third day, he stopped in the middle of the page and read the same clause several times over. And then he read it again with a ruler under the line, the way people do when they are hoping the words will rearrange themselves. They did not. He went back to his desk and sat for a while without writing anything. That is worth saying plainly, because it is the whole scene. A man sat at a desk for the better part of an hour, in a room with a broken chair he had never reported, holding a page. Then he wrote a memorandum. It was 106 words long, and it was the most careful thing he ever wrote. It said that Article 62 of the Concord contained a clause on the person of the custodian, that the clause attached consequences to the use of force upon that person, that those consequences fell upon the acceding party rather than upon the actor, and that in his opinion, offered without expertise, the proposed instrument should be reviewed by counsel before execution. He did not quote the clause. He wrote the number, and he wrote what it did. He stamped his own copy, logged the transmission, and sent it up. It arrived. That is the part people get wrong afterward. It was received, receipted, and read. The directorate sat 2 days later with the memorandum in the folder, and Dravel had it opened and set on the table where everyone could see it, because Dravel was not a careless man and did not like being told he was. Counsel Ostrek, who advised the directorate and who was, on the facts, the best lawyer in the room, gave his view in about 90 seconds. The clause was ancient. It had never been invoked. It contemplated a world of 4 parties in personal custody, and that world was gone. There was a principle, he said, that a provision unused for 4 centuries has been abandoned by the practice of the parties. Verne said, "Counsel, has any court said that about this Concord?" Ostrek said, "No court has been asked." It was not evasion, it was accurate. Verne looked at the memorandum for a moment and then asked the question the room needed asked. "Arbiter," he said, "if we remove him, who holds the Concord?" Dravel said, "We do." Verne said, "By what instrument?" And Dravel said, "By the fact that it will be in our hands." There is a kind of answer that is not an argument. It is a description of a floor plan. The room accepted it because the room had already accepted it 4 years earlier and had merely been waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Nobody in that chamber was stupid. Every one of them could have taken the memorandum home and read the article and understood it in 20 minutes. What stopped them was not stupidity. It was that a small clerk had raised a large objection. And there is an instinct in every institution, older than any of its rules, that treats the size of the messenger as evidence about the size of the message. Tazek was thanked. 2 days later, he was promoted. He became principal custodian of the council archive, which came with a room on the outer face, a window, a chair that did not tilt, a staff of 4, and a salary raised by a 5th. It was better in every measurable way. The archive charter, which he read on his first morning because reading things was his defect, provided that the principal custodian corresponded with the directorate through the office of the secretariat and did not correspond with the directorate directly. He had been given a better office and taken out of the conversation, and it had been done kindly by people who believed they were rewarding him. He hung his old stamp on a hook by the door and did not use it for 3 months. At 5:30 in the afternoon on the 18th of May, First Arbiter Custodian signed the instrument of removal. Council procedure required a written instrument for any application of force to a person under Concord protection, and Draval, who was a careful man, complied. He signed it, sealed it, and had it lodged with the Concord Registry at 5:44, because the same procedure required that too. The council filed its own order with the office it was about to raid. 16 minutes later, 4 Marines walked down the stone corridor toward the registry door. Sergeant Bell Mulvar had been told the room would be empty by the time he got there. It was not empty. There was an old man at the long table with a pen and a stack of ledgers open to his left, and a cup of something that had gone cold hours ago and had a ring around the inside of it. There was one clerk standing very still by the shelves. There was a framed document on the wall behind the table, the glass dusty, the paper the color of weak tea. Mulvar read the removal order aloud because that was the procedure. Then he said, "Admiral, you need to stand up." Reyes did not look up right away. He finished the line he was on. Then he set the pen down, squared it with the edge of the ledger, and looked at the sergeant with the mild attention of a man asked to move his car. He said, "How many systems have you signed for today, Sergeant?" Mulvar said, "Sir, stand up." Reyes said, "I am at entry 298. There are 8 left. If I stop now, the entries are incomplete, and the priority order for the next year is unsettled, and about 400,000 people will find out what that means in about a month." Mulvar said the order again. He said it correctly and without cruelty. He was 26 years old, and he had never done this before, and he wanted very much to do it properly. Reyes said, "Not yet." Then he reached slowly toward the desk drawer. In the drawer was a brass hand stamp. That is all that was in the drawer. He had been reaching for it for 40 years the same way, and the motion was not fast, and it was not concealed, and any one of the 4 men in that room could have watched it happen and understood it perfectly. But a hand going into a drawer is a hand going into a drawer. The Marine on Mulvar's left had been awake for 19 hours and had been told that this station was hostile and that the old man was the reason it was. Reyes raised his other hand and pointed at the wall, at the frame, at a line about 2/3 of the way down the second column. He said 5 words. He said, "Not yet. Read the wall." Then there were 2 shots. It is worth being exact because everything afterward turned on exactness. 2 rounds, 6:17 in the evening, station time. The recording from the room's fixed camera, which existed because the registry recorded everything and always had, caught the sound, the fall, the pen rolling off the table, and the direction the old man's finger had been pointing. Mulvar shouted for a medic before the second casing hit the floor. The medic came. The medic was good. It did not matter. Admiral Tomas Reyes, custodian of the Concord of Vesa Minor, died at 6:39, 22 minutes later, on the floor of the room where the treaty had been signed 400 years, 2 months, and 6 days earlier. The clerk by the shelves had not moved. Nobody had told her to. After a while, she walked over, picked up the pen, and put it back on the table. And then she went and stood by the shelves again, because there was nothing else in her training that covered it. Mulvar sealed the room. He was shaking. He filed his report that night, and he told the truth in it, which cost him his career and was the only thing he ever got right about that evening. And he said so himself, later, to the 2 people who asked. Word reached the Directorate Chamber at 6:51. Dravel received it standing. He asked whether the register was intact. He was told it was. He asked whether the seal was recovered. He was told it was in the drawer with a brass stamp and some paper clips. He was quiet for a moment, and the men in the room later disagreed about what the quiet meant. Then he said, "The chair is vacant. fill it. What he did not know, what nobody on his side would understand for another 60 hours, was that at 6:17 the registry had already done the only thing it had ever been built to do. The Concord Register is not a book that waits for a librarian. It is a live instrument. It publishes title. Every hull moving under Concord Transit carries a title reference that the Register validates on a rolling cycle. And the Register validates against the accession list. And the accession list is a list of parties whose accession is in force. At 6:17 and some seconds, in a rack of equipment behind the shelves that nobody in the building had thought about in decades, a condition that had sat dormant for 400 years, evaluated as true. No alarm sounded. No light came on. There was nothing to see. 4 hours later, at a navigation buoy 11 light minutes out from the Vesa Minor Primary, a maintenance log recorded a change of status it had no field for and appended it as free text, and no living person read it for 2 days. The Terran Concord office occupies the old Customs House in New Bedford, Massachusetts, a granite building with a fan light over the door and a stone floor worn into a trough where 2 centuries of people walk to the same counter. It has 12 employees. It has a copier that jams. It has a coffee machine that somebody's grandmother donated in a year nobody can establish, and a laminated sign above it that says, "Please," in capitals, without further instruction. On the second floor there is a fireproof vault with the earth counterpart of the Concord in it, and a humidity log that has been filled in by hand, daily, for 400 years, because at some point in the 23rd century, a custodian decided the automatic sensor could not be trusted, and no one since had felt entitled to overrule him. 12 people, 52,000 hulls. That was the ratio nobody on the council had ever bothered to compute, and it would have told them everything if they had. Chief Counsel Sella Doyle was 56 years old and had worked in that building for 30 years. She was woken at 17 minutes past midnight on the 19th of May by a duty officer who said only that there was traffic from Vesa Minor and that she should come in. She came in. She read the message standing in the hallway with her coat still on. She read it 3 times. Then she read it again. Then she sat down on the second step of the staircase, not because she was overcome, but because her legs had reached a conclusion ahead of the rest of her. The building was cold. Somewhere out past the breakwater the fog signal was going, 2 blasts and a wait, the way it had gone every foggy night of her life. She had met Admiral Reyes for the first time 30 years earlier, in 2544, when she was 26 and had been in the office 9 months and had been sent to a negotiation to carry files. The council had come to Earth that year with a proposal to modernize the Concord. It was a generous proposal. It offered a revenue share on corridor fees, an upgrade to the registry equipment, 12 scholarships a year, and a permanent liaison seat in the assembly gallery with speaking rights. In exchange, it asked for a package of what it called housekeeping amendments. Reyes gave them the revenue share formula they wanted, which was worse for Earth. He gave them the equipment tender. He gave them the venue and the language of the record. He gave away 4 things in one afternoon, cheerfully, and the council delegation went to dinner believing they had found the softest negotiator in the sector. The next morning he declined the 5th item. The 5th item was the repeal of Article 62 as obsolete. The head of the council delegation raised the offer twice. Reyes said no both times, in the same unhurried voice, without giving a reason, which infuriated them more than a reason would have. Afterward, in the corridor, Doyle asked him why. He said, because they asked for it last. Then he said the other thing, the one she would repeat for the rest of her life. He said, paper outlives people. That is not a comfort, it is a warning. Later that same week, he lodged a standing instrument with the registry, naming his successor in the custodianship, as every custodian must, and he named a 26-year-old junior who carried files. He never mentioned it to her. She found out about it at 17 minutes past midnight on the 19th of May, 2574, sitting on a staircase in a cold building, from the second paragraph of a message about a man's death. The three junior counsel came in without being called. Yuri Pell, Anit Rao, Gus Ben. Between them, they had 11 years of experience and one working printer. Doyle put the Concord on the table and said, "Tell me the honest number." Pell said, "Ma'am?" She said, "Our fleet. What do we have?" Ben said, 31 hulls. 22 of them are museum pieces. Against 4,800. She said, "Right, so that is not the number." Rao said, "Then what is?" Doyle turned the copy around so it faced them and put her finger on the second column, about 2/3 of the way down, on the same line an old man had pointed at 6 hours earlier and 4 light years away. She said, "Their accession, 2216. They joined this. They did not write it. Everything they have, every corridor, every bond, every court, comes to them through a door we hold. And this clause says what happens to the door." Pell read it. He got about halfway through and stopped and said, quietly, "That cannot be right." Doyle said, "It has been right for 400 years. Nobody had read it. Somebody read it now." They worked until 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, and what they produced was 4 pages long and contained no adjectives. It was a notice of voidance under Article 62, Clause 3, citing the hour of the act, the identity of the party, and the instrument by which the party had authorized it. Doyle signed it as Custodian, which was the first time she had written those words after her name, and she wrote them badly. Bain asked if they should wait until morning and get the foreign ministry on it. Doyle said no. Bain asked if they should at least call the fleet. She said, "Not yet." Ola Ferris was not supposed to be on the desk that morning. She was the night registrar at the bonded relay on the outer ring, and her shift ended at 6, and at 6 the day registrar did not come, because the station had gone into lockdown at 7 the previous evening, and the trams were stopped and half the ring was walking. So she stayed. She made tea in a pot with a chip spout. She filled in the overnight log. At 20 minutes past 8, station time, a transmission came in on the Concord channel with a Terran authentication block on it, and Ferris did what she had done 14,000 times, which was open the receipt register, enter the sender, enter the class, enter the hour and the minute, and bring the stamp down. There were 2 council Marines standing 8 feet away. They had been standing there since 6. One of them said, "The office is closed." Ferris said, "The office closes when the registry says it closes." The Marine said it again, less certainly. Ferris said, "Do you want to be the man who tells me to alter a time entry? Do you understand what that is?" He did not answer, because he did not, in fact, understand what that was, and because she had said it the way people say things they have said in their heads 100 times and never expected to say out loud. She stamped it. She logged it as received at 20 minutes past 8. At 8:30, a lieutenant arrived with a written order and sealed the office. 10 minutes. Ferris was suspended within the hour and dismissed within the month, on the grounds that she had processed traffic during a security suspension. She never worked in a registry again. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained why she did it, including her. She was asked years later by a historian with a notebook, and she said she had a stamp and a register and something came in. Then she asked whether the historian wanted more tea. By the middle of the second day, the council had 11 separate problems and did not yet know that they were one problem. A grain carrier out of On was refused a berth at Tome Reach because its transit title failed validation. The portmaster assumed a software fault and put it on the outer anchorage. By evening, he had 4 more, and a note from his own registry office saying the fault was not local. At Halvern Crossing, they turned away 2. At Sec, they turned away 1, and then, because the portmaster there was a cautious woman with a lawyer for a brother, they suspended all council-titled traffic pending clarification. 7 ports by the end of the second day. Dravel was told at breakfast on the 3rd, and dismissed it as a systems failure at the registry, which was a reasonable conclusion because the registry had just been raided by his own Marines and had a sealed door and a dead man's blood on the floor and no clerk in it. It did not occur to him that the register did not need a clerk. There is a particular way an institution goes wrong. It is not that the warning does not arrive. It is that the warning arrives at a person who has been carefully placed where his arrival cannot cost anyone anything. Ansel Tazek watched the third day from a room with a window. He had a staff of 4 and a chair that did not tilt, and a view of the docking spines, and he could see the anchorage filling up. He wrote a second memorandum. He sent it to the office of the Secretariat as his charter required. The Secretariat acknowledged receipt within the hour, which was efficient, and scheduled it for the standing review, which met on the last working day of the month. Vern found out anyway, because Vern read things. He came to Dravel on the 4th day with the port list. He said, "Arbiter, 7 ports on the 2nd day, 40 this morning." Dravel said, "Because they are frightened." Vern said, "Sir, they are not frightened. They are being told no by their own equipment." Dravel said the registry would be restored to function within the week, and the council appointee would validate every title on the list personally, and that was the end of the conversation. And it was not an unreasonable plan. It contained one error. It assumed the council still had titles to validate. At 6 in the morning on the 21st of May, the Haldrum Mutual, which is not a government and does not care about anyone's dignity, issued a notice to its members. The Mutual underwrites hull and cargo for most of the council merchant fleet, and its policies are written against Concord Transit Title, and its lawyers, who are paid a great deal precisely so that they will read things, had read Article 62 on the 2nd day. The notice suspended cover on every council-titled hull, effective from 6:17 in the evening on the 18th of May, retroactively, because that is what the clause said. 52,000 hulls. Uninsured cargo cannot be discharged because no port will accept the liability. Uninsured hulls cannot transit because no corridor authority will pass them. So they stopped, all of them, wherever they were. 52,000 is not a number that means anything. This is what it means. A council merchant hull carries an average crew of 27. 1,404,000 people woke up that morning on ships that were not going anywhere, could not be paid, could not be landed, and in 900 cases could not buy food at the port they were sitting in because their ship's credit was drawn against a bond that no longer existed. A woman on a tanker at Halvern Crossing called her daughter to say she would not be home for the birthday. She was not the only one. She was one of 1,404,000. The wall the Terran office ran into was not the council's fleet. It was 3 sheets of paper. Ostrek was good. Within 6 days, he had filed a response that did 3 things at once, and any one of them would have been enough to finish a smaller office. First, he argued desuetude, that a clause never invoked in 4 centuries had been abandoned by the practice of the parties, and he cited 9 instances in other treaties where that argument had won. Second, he attacked service, arguing that the notice of voidance had been received by a suspended clerk during a lawful security closure and was therefore a nullity. Third, and this was the clever one, he filed a counterclaim because on the 20th of May, a Terran frigate had crossed the Vesa Minor exclusion arc and destroyed a council survey buoy. Force, said Ostrek, force by Earth, within the Concord zone, 48 hours after the incident. The clause cuts both ways. The room they worked in was on the 3rd floor of the customs house and had a radiator that came on at unpredictable hours with a noise like someone dropping a wrench. There were 4 of them, and a whiteboard, and a box of pastries from the place on the corner that closed at 2 and was therefore always a day old. They went at the desuetude argument for 3 days. They went at the service argument for 2. They were losing both, in the way you lose an argument when your opponent is right about how the world usually works. Pell said at one point, We are going to lose this on a technicality about a clerk's shift pattern. Doyle said, then find a better argument. Pell said, ma'am, there is not one. She said, not yet. At 3 in the morning on the 9th day, Anit Rao got up, walked to the board, and said the group had been thinking about it wrong. Everyone in the room was thinking about the notice, she said, whether it was served, when it was served, who stamped it. But the clause does not say the accession is void when notice is served. It says the accession is void from the hour of the act. The notice does not do the voiding, the act does. The notice is just how the rest of the galaxy finds out. Bain said, then we do not have to prove the notice, we have to prove the act. Rao said, yes. And then she said the thing that ended it. She said, who proved the act? They proved it themselves. Council procedure required a written instrument for the application of force to a person under Concord protection. Council procedure further required that the instrument be lodged with the Concord registry before execution. At 5:44 in the afternoon on the 18th of May, a council clerk whose name appears nowhere else in this story walked into the registry and lodged the instrument of removal, signed and sealed by First Arbiter Kes Dravel, 33 minutes before the shots. It was receipted. It was logged. It sat in the file with the council's own seal on it, an authenticated, dated, signed declaration by the acceding party that the acceding party had authorized the application of force to the person of the custodian. Nobody had to serve it on anybody. It was already there. Doyle looked at the board for a while and said, they did the paperwork. Rao said, they always do the paperwork. That is what they are. There is a dry joke buried in the 4th day of that hearing, and it is this. If Dravel had been a worse administrator, if he had told 4 Marines to go and handle it and said nothing on paper, the council would have had a case. What convicted them was not brutality, it was compliance. Counsel Ostrek learned this on the 11th day, and he learned it alone, which is the worst way. He had pulled the registry file to build the service attack, and he wanted the receipt log to show that the office had been in security closure, and he was going through the entries for the 18th in order, and he found it at 5:44, 3 lines above the incident. Instrument of removal. Lodged. Receipted. Council seal. He put his hand flat on the page. He read it, and then he read the 3 entries below it, and then he sat back. There was a coffee ring on the table by his elbow that somebody had left days earlier and nobody had wiped. He looked at that instead of the page. He was in the room for about 20 minutes. When he came out, he went upstairs and asked for an appointment with the First Arbiter, and was told the First Arbiter was in session, and asked for an appointment with the second chair, and got one for the following morning. In that intervening night, he wrote nothing down. Ostrek was the best lawyer in the building. He had been right about the way courts usually treat old clauses. He had been right about the weakness of the service. He had been right, on the facts, about almost everything he had said in that chamber. He was going to lose anyway, and he understood it before anybody else on his side did, and he had to carry it by himself for 14 hours because the man who needed to hear it was in session. The 12th day is the one they teach, not because anything was fired, and not because anyone shouted, because on the 12th day the Concord did in public what it had already done in private, and the whole of council space discovered at once that it had been standing on a floor that was owned by somebody else. At Tome Reach, 126 ports had suspended council-titled traffic. The outer anchorage held 430 hulls at a facility rated for 60. At SEC, the portmaster closed the corridor mouth entirely and put 2 tenders on station to hand out water. At Halvern Crossing, a council captain tried to berth without title and was met by a harbor tug, unarmed, which simply positioned itself in the slot and stared there. The captain, who had 31 years and a spotless record, backed off and anchored, and later said it was the only time in his life he had been beaten by a boat with no guns. Arbitration went next. The Concord courts hold about 11,000 live matters at any time. In every award, and every pending claim in which a council party appeared as an acceding party was stayed on the same morning by the registrar's own hand, because a party without accession has no standing to sue and none to be sued. 240 million marks of judgment debt owed to council carriers became, for the moment, unenforceable. That sounds like a windfall. It was not. It meant nobody would trade with them because there was no court to go to if the trade went wrong. Salvage went next. 3 wrecks under council claim reverted to open salvage and were on the seabed of the Vesa shallows within a week with other people's crews on them. Bonds went next. The corridor bonds are held in escrow against title, and title had gone, so the escrow agents released 410 million marks back to the granting systems in accordance with instructions written in 2174 by people who never expected them to be read. And in the middle of it, on the 20th of May, Commander Ivo Marsh did the stupidest useful thing in the whole affair. Marsh commanded the frigate Halstead, which was one of Earth's 31 and one of the 9 that were not museum pieces. He had been at Vesa Minor on a courier rotation. He had known Reyes for 18 years. When the body was not released, he took the Halstead across the exclusion arc at 2200 alone and demanded it. When the council picket ordered him back, he put a single round through an unmanned survey buoy at 4,000 meters. And then he held station, weapons hot, for 40 minutes, and then he came about and left. He did not fire on the picket. He did not, in the end, get the body. He got the council a counterclaim, and he very nearly got Earth's case struck. Doyle heard about it at 4 in the morning. She did not shout. She asked for the value of the buoy. She was given it, 31,000 marks. She asked for the Concord published interest rate, computed the interest at 218 marks, and wired 31,218 marks to the council treasury before breakfast, with a covering letter accepting liability in full, expressing regret, waiving any defense, and requesting a receipt. It was, by consensus, the most courteous surrender document anyone in the sector had ever filed. It cost Earth 31,218 marks, and it removed the counterclaim from the case. And Ostrek, who saw it first, said out loud to an empty office that they had just been paid off with pocket change. Marsh was relieved of command on the 23rd and sent home. He read the reprimand until he had it by heart. He concluded that he had been the only person on his side willing to act. He was wrong about that, and he never revised it. In the directorate chamber, Draval finally understood the shape of it on the 12th day, at about 11 in the morning, when the chief of corridor operations told him that the transponder validation could not be overridden from the council side. Draval said, "Override it from ours." The chief said, "Sir, there is no ours. The override authority is written into the register as the Custodians. It has always been the Custodians." Draval said, "Then instruct the registry." The chief said, "The registry takes instruction from the Custodian." Draval said, "The Custodian is dead." And the chief of corridor operations, a career officer with no interest in law and no reason to be cruel, said the sentence that went round the building by evening. He said, "Sir, we were told there was a successor named in 2544. There was a silence in that chamber that people described afterward in different ways, and all of the descriptions are about how long it was." Then Draval said, "Withdraw the instrument of removal from the registry file." Ostrek, who had come up the stairs 2 minutes before and was standing at the back of the room with a folder he had not yet opened, said, "Arbiter, it was receipted." Draval said, "Withdraw it." Ostrek said, "Sir, it was receipted at 5:44. Second Chair Verne commissioned the honest assessment on the 15th day, and he did it without telling Draval, which is technically a disciplinary matter in which nobody ever raised. He gave it to 3 people, none of them senior, and he told them he did not want a recommendation, he wanted the state of things. They came back in 4 days with 11 pages. He read them at his desk with the door shut and a sandwich he did not eat. 214 of 306 member systems had suspended council-titled traffic. 52,000 hulls were stopped. 1,404,000 crew were unpaid, and in a growing number of cases, unfed. Corridor revenue had gone to nothing in 19 days. The Mutual had begun issuing new cover to Vesa, Haldrum, and On hulls at rates 30% under the old council book, because those hulls had title and council hulls did not. And every week that continued was a week the freight business rearranged itself around the council's absence. That was the line in the assessment that Vern read twice. Markets do not wait for law. They route around it, and then they get used to the new route. The directorate met on the 20th day and put 4 options on the table, and one by one they took them off. Seize the registry. It was already seized. It made no difference because the register validated title against the accession list, and the accession list was not a document that could be edited. It was a chain of instruments, and every copy of the chain existed in 4 vaults on 4 worlds, 3 of them belonging to parties who were now doing very well. Also, and Vern made them say it aloud, the Vesa had closed the system on the 14th day. Any move on the registry building would be force against the host of the Concord. And while Article 62 would not apply to that, the other 3 original signatories would not need a clause to know what to do about it. Amend the Concord. Amendment requires a 2/3 vote of member systems, which is 204 of 306, and 60 days notice from the tabling. The council had tabled an amendment on the 20th of May, promptly and correctly. It was returned unread. A party whose accession is void has no standing to table. They had lost the ability to fix it in the same act that broke it, and they had lost it 33 minutes before they broke it, at 5:44, when a clerk lodged an instrument and got it stamped. Repudiate the Concord entirely. Walk away, build new corridors, new courts, new bonds. Ostrek costed it. Between 40 and 60 years, and in the first 8 of them, the council would be a landlocked power with a war fleet it could not supply past its own frontier. Somebody in the room said the war fleet could take the corridors. Ostrek asked how many of the 4,800 were rated for sustained, independent operation without bonded resupply. And the answer was 260, and the room went quiet again. Pay, offer money. The assessment noted, in a flat line at the bottom of page 8, that Earth had not asked for money, had not asked for territory, had not asked for an apology, and had in fact paid the council 31,218 marks for a buoy. Somebody suggested that this was a negotiating posture. Vern said, "It may be. It is also possible they simply do not want anything from us, which would be worse." Then Vern opened the folder and read the memorandum aloud. 106 words, sent on the 14th of May by the clerk of records, receipted, read, and placed on the table where everyone could see it. He read the whole thing, including the last sentence, in which a man with no standing had asked that council review the instrument before execution. When he finished, he said, "We have the receipt. It is in the file. It has my initials on it." Dravel said, "Where is he now?" Vern said, "He is principal custodian of the archive. We gave him a window." Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything at all for a while. And then, because he was thorough, Vern asked the archive for everything the council held on Earth. And the archive sent up 3 crates, and in the 3rd crate, in a folder marked with a strike order, was a survey report filed in 2544 by Survey Officer Aneth Cry after 14 months on Earth. It ran to 60 pages. Its 2nd paragraph said that Earth had no fleet worth counting, and that this was not the relevant fact, because Earth held the Concord, and the Concord held the Council, and that any assessment of Earth that began with hulls was an assessment of the wrong object. Cry had been referred to a medical board 8 weeks after filing, found unfit for further survey duty, and reassigned to dockside inspection. Her report had been struck from the record. The board had been convened at the request of Deputy Surveyor Halvane, who had taken her post 4 months later, and who had done it for no darker reason than that he wanted it. Vern read the report twice and then sat looking at the strike order, which was a single printed line with a date and an initial. Struck from the record, 3 words in a signature had cost the council 400 years of advantage, and had done it by removing the only accurate description of the situation from the only place anyone would have looked. On the 24th day, without consulting the directorate, Second Chair Vern sent a message to the Customs House in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It did not mention terms. It asked whether the custodian would receive him. The hearing opened on the 88th day, the 14th of August, in the room where it had happened, because Doyle insisted and the Vesa agreed. The floor had been cleaned. The frame was still on the wall. There were 42 chairs and 130 people, so most of the council delegation stood at the back for 11 days, in good suits, in a room with a bad ceiling light. Ostrek argued for 4 hours on the first morning, and he was excellent. He argued that the clause contemplated personal custody in an age of 4 parties and could not sensibly govern an institution of 306. He argued that the Marine had acted in fright, not in policy, and that no system of law attaches the consequences of a state act to a startled man of 26. He argued that 4 centuries of non-invocation had drained the clause of force. He did not raise his voice once, and he did not misstate a single fact. And when he sat down, there were people in that room who thought he had won. Doyle answered in about 20 minutes. She said the Concord contained no provision for lapse. It contained a provision for amendment at Article 50, requiring 204 systems in 60 days, and the parties had used it 11 times in 400 years, and the Council itself had used it in 2390. A treaty with a working amendment procedure does not abandon clauses by neglect, she said. It abandons them by amending them. They had 400 years to do it. In 2544 they asked, and they were refused, and they did not press. On the question of the frightened Marine, she said the Council was entitled to that argument, and it was a good one. And then she asked that the room be shown the recording. This is the part that is described the same way by everyone who was there. The registry camera runs at a fixed angle from the corner above the shelves. It shows the long table, the old man, the 4 Marines, the wall. The sound is poor. You can hear the order read. You can hear a question about how many systems the sergeant has signed for. You can see the pen set down and squared to the edge of the ledger. You can see the hand go slowly toward the drawer and the other hand come up and point, and you can hear 5 words quite clearly because he had a carrying voice and had spent 84 years learning to be heard in bad rooms. Not yet. Read the wall. Then 2 shots and the sound of a pen rolling. Doyle stopped the recording there and did not play the rest, and she said, "We are not here about the sergeant." Then she put the instrument of removal on the table, signed and sealed by the first arbiter, receipted at 5:44 on the 18th of May by the Council's own clerk in this building, and she said, "We are here about the man who wrote it down." Nobody in that room asked another question about intent for the remaining 10 days. The offer came on the 9th day, privately, and it was enormous. Restoration of accession by consent. In exchange, Earth would receive a permanent seat on the Directorate with full vote, a corridor revenue share of 4% in perpetuity, a shipbuilding subsidy sufficient to take the Earth fleet from 31 hulls to 200, and the custodianship confirmed in the Terran office by statute forever. It was everything a small power spends 4 centuries wanting. Doyle said no. She gave them 4 things first, cheerfully, the way she had watched an old man do it 30 years earlier. She gave them the timetable they asked for, which was better for them. She gave them the venue for the restoration, which was their chamber and not this room. She gave them the language of the record, which described the incident as an unauthorized application of force, a phrase Ostrek had fought for and which she thought was worth exactly nothing. She gave them a 5-year phase-in on the corridor fee schedule, which cost Earth real money. Then she named what she wanted, and it was small, and there were 3 items. First, that Article 62 stand unamended and be read aloud at every accession thereafter. Second, that an independent audit of the accession list be conducted every 10 years by the registry, published, and paid for by the council. Third, that the survey report filed in 2544 by Survey Officer Aneth Cry be restored to the record in full, with the strike order annulled and the circumstances of the medical board entered as an appendix. The council delegation asked for a recess. They came back and asked, more than once, whether she understood what she was declining. She said she did. On the 10th evening, she and Vern sat in the market street outside the leak with 2 cups of something from the woman with the heated case, and there were no aides and no recording. Vern said, "You could have had a fleet." Doyle said, "We had a fleet in 2174. So did you. It is why we needed the paper." Vern said, "You cannot possibly believe that a clause will protect you next time." Doyle said, "No. I believe that a clause is the only thing a small party can build that keeps working while it sleeps. You have 4,800 ships, and every one of them needs feeding, crewing, refitting, and commanding by someone who might be tired or frightened or 26 years old. We had 1 sentence, and it did not need any of that. It sat in a frame on a wall for 400 years, and it did not get tired." Vern said, "He knew, in 44. When he refused." Doyle said, "He knew that somebody would try eventually. He did not know it would be him." She turned the cup around in her hands and said, "He was 106. He had 8 entries left to sign." Vern said, "I am sorry." She said, "I know. It does not help, and you should say it anyway." The instrument of restoration was signed on the 107th day, the 2nd of September 2574, at a table in the Directorate Chamber, by Second Chair Halden Vern for the Council of Bound Systems, and by Selah Doyle, Custodian, for the Concord. Dravel did not sign. Dravel had resigned on the 94th day. Nobody celebrated. Nobody celebrated, and here is the specific accounting of why. Admiral Tomas Reyes was dead, and his 8 remaining entries were countersigned by his successor with a different hand, which is noted in the register and will be noted forever. 1,404,000 crew had gone unpaid for 2 months, and 11,000 of them never got the back pay because the operators that owed it did not survive. 430 hulls sat at Tome Reach long enough that 62 of them were sold for scrap where they lay. Ola Ferris lost her position and was never reinstated, and the restoration instrument did not mention her, because Doyle asked for 3 things and got 3 things, and Ferris was not one of them, and Doyle carried that. Sergeant Bell Mulvar was discharged. Commander Evo Marsh was retired at his rank and lived another 31 years in a town in Maine and told the story the same way every time, and it was always the version in which he had been the only one willing to act. And the corridors reopened, and freight rates fell, and within 4 years the whole thing had been absorbed into the way business had always been done, which is the fate of every catastrophe that gets fixed. The ripples went further than the ledger. The Haldrum Mutual rewrote every policy it held to include a clause requiring an annual certificate that the insured parties' treaty accessions were current, and every other underwriter in known space copied it within 2 years. And to this day, a hull cannot be covered anywhere without a piece of paper that exists because of one afternoon on Vessa Minor. The ON established a chair of Concord law at their Central Academy, and the first thing taught in the first term is the difference between a right you hold and a right you were granted. At SEC, the portmaster who had closed her corridor on the 2nd day was made harbor commissioner and put a framed copy of the accession list on the wall of her office where visitors could see it, which visitors found peculiar and which she never explained. And in 11 separate small polities that had spent centuries assuming their only options were submission or a fleet they could not afford, Somebody in a back office pulled out the founding instruments and started reading them with a ruler under the line. That was the real consequence, and it did not appear in any assessment for 30 years. Aneth Cray was 68 years old and inspecting cargo seals on the dockside at Halvern Crossing when the notice came through that her report had been restored to the record. She read it on a hand terminal in the rain with a clipboard under her arm. She finished her shift. Halvane found her 3 weeks later in a corridor at the council survey office where she had been summoned to give evidence about the medical board. He was not a monster, and he had not slept well in a month. He said he had never doubted her competence. He said that he had been told the report was politically difficult and that he had been young and had wanted the post. He said, "You were right. You were right about all of it." Cray looked at him for a moment. She said, "Being right about a bad thing is not the same as winning." Then she said, "I lost 30 years, and you got a post, and now they have given me my 60 pages back and given you a disciplinary letter, and neither of those is what either of us wanted." She went back to work. She stayed on the dockside until she was 74, and she declined the registry appointment they offered her twice. And when a historian asked her why, she said that she had spent 30 years learning to trust things she could put her hand on, and cargo seals were one and committees were not. Ansel Tazik remained principal custodian of the archive. The new directorate, which was substantially the old one with different chairs, asked his opinion on everything for about a year, and he found it exhausting and slightly insulting, and eventually he told the secretariat that he would be glad to certify any instrument they liked, but that he would prefer they read it themselves first. They did not take offense. They put his memorandum, all 106 words of it, in the standing induction pack for new members, where it remains. Selah Doyle went home to New Bedford in October. The fog signal was going the night she got in, 2 blasts and a wait. She let herself into the customs house at 6:30 in the morning because the copier still jammed and somebody had to do the humidity log, and the sheet for the 19th of May was blank, the only gap in 400 years, because on that day everyone in the building had been upstairs doing something else. She wrote in the estimated figure and initialed the correction and noted the reason in the margin in her own hand. And it took her 4 minutes, and nobody has ever asked her about it. Reyes had left the brass hand stamp to the office rather than to her, which she thought was correct. It sits in the same drawer. It says "Received," and the letters are worn nearly flat. And every registrar since has used it on things that do not require it, which is not a tradition anyone has written down. Hesper Lund came to see her in 2596, 22 years afterward, with a notebook and a recorder she did not use. Doyle was 78 and made tea badly and apologized for it. Lund asked the question historians always ask, which is what single decision changed everything. She expected to be told about the night of the 19th of May, the 4 pages, the transmission at 20 minutes past 2. Doyle said it was none of that. She said the decision was made in 2544, in a room on the 2nd floor of that building, by a man of 76 who had already given away 4 things he cared about, and then declined a 5th for no reason he was willing to state. She said, "I filed a notice. Anyone in this office could have filed that notice, and one of them would have by lunchtime. He is the one who made sure there was something to file." Lund asked whether he had known. Doyle said, "He knew what the clause was for. He did not know it was for him." Then she said the other thing, and Lund wrote it in the notebook, and it became the sentence everyone quotes. "Paper outlives people. That is not a comfort, it is a warning. It works for whoever bothered to read it, and for 400 years, the only people who bothered were the ones with nothing else." Lund asked to see the frame. It is still on the wall in the registry on Vesa Minor, above the long table, at a fixed angle from the camera in the corner, and every accession since the 2nd of September 2574 has begun with the reading aloud of one clause in the 2nd column, about 2/3 of the way down, at the line where an old man was pointing when he was shot. Article 62, Clause 3. No party may lay hands upon the custodian. Where a party lays hands upon the custodian, the accession of that party is void from the hour of the act, and every right granted to it under this concord returns, entire, to those who granted it. They shot the oldest man in the fleet, and the paper he was pointing at outlived them all.